Hello, friends. Back again for Bible study at home with First Baptist Roswell. My name is Logan, and I'm so glad you are joining us once again for our Bible study at home. We are going to be continuing these throughout the fall and probably starting a new series soon, working on that. So for now, we are continuing with our one chapter wonders study. We so far have done 2 John the first week. We did Jude last week, very interesting book. And this week we're mixing it up with the only one chapter book in the Old Testament, Obadiah. So, hope you are ready to study some Obadiah today. And I'll ask you, what do you know about Obadiah? Much of anything? I got to tell you, I didn't know much before studying all this. Since it is the only one chapter book in the Old Testament, I did know that, and so it is the shortest book of the entire Old Testament. I'll also tell you what I know. I was in Bible drill growing up. It was a big deal in our family. I really enjoyed knowing all the verses and winning at Bible drill. But Obadiah was the book that scared us all half to death. Because, like 2 John, 3 John, you can find those. They're at the end. Obadiah is sandwiched in the middle or towards the end of the Old Testament, one page, very hard to find. So I'll tell you what I still remember. We memorized the page number, page 789 in the old Bible drill Bibles that we use. So that's about what I knew growing up. I'll tell you some other things about it, and then we'll get into the text. We don't know much about this prophet, Obadiah, who is the author of the book. There is an Obadiah mentioned in 1 Kings. He was kind of famous for hiding other prophets from Jezebel, Ahab's wife, who wanted to kill them. But the timelines don't match up for that to be the same Obadiah who wrote this book. So we really don't know anything about him. We know his name means servant of God or worshiper of Yahweh. But that's it. We don't know much about him. And a little bit more about this book. These short 21 verses are poems of divine judgment against Edom, not against Israel and Judah. Many of the prophets were talking about Israel or Judah. This one is against Edom. Edom was a nation that neighbored Israel and Judah, kind of southeast of Judah. And the book is divided into two halves. The first half, verses 1 to 14, are accusations against Edom for their pride and self-exaltation. And then the second half kind of changes gears a little bit. So let's get right into it. What we're going to do is, normally I take just a few verses at a time. This time we are going to read the entire first half. So verses 1 to 14, and then talk about them a little bit. So here we go. Obadiah verses 1 to 14 says this. The vision of Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, "Rise, let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. If thieves came to you, if robbers in the night, oh, what a disaster awaits you. Would they not steal only as much as they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave a few grapes? But how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. All your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, those of understanding in the mountains of Esau? Your warriors, Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof, while strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. All right, so that is verses 1 to 14 of the book of Obadiah. And I hope you noticed some things in here that were pretty interesting. If you were with us during our sprint through the Old Testament, there are some references in there. He doesn't really call them Edomites very much or talk about them as Edom. He says that at the very beginning, this is what the sovereign Lord says against Edom. But did you notice how he referenced them the rest of the time as Esau, right? And the accusations are about Esau attacking Jacob. Now, was Obadiah a prophet in the time of Jacob and Esau? No, this is much, much later in the 600s or 500s BC. And so what exactly is he talking about? Well, if this is all coming full circle. We're getting to reference our other studies. Jacob, right? Name became Israel, and he had 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, and that's where the Israelite people came from, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob stole the birthright from Esau, right? We didn't get to that story very much in the sprint because we were sprinting. But Jacob and Esau's relationship, let's just say a little tense, right? Well, Israel and Judah, once they split, descended from Jacob. Esau's name was later changed to Edom. And so the Edomites are descended from Esau. And those brothers did not like each other, and that tradition continued for many, many, many years. Okay, the Israelites and the Edomites do not like each other. I mean, they have this distant relationship, right? They have this, all kind of have this same ancestor that they trace it back to, and not just any, but the famous ones, right? Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau. But they did not get along. The tense relationship with the brothers continued, and there was hatred among each of these different people groups. So Obadiah is prophesying at the time after the destruction of Jerusalem. And here's what happened. Because the Edomites did not care for Israel and Judah, they rather enjoyed seeing Babylon come in and take them down. They didn't mind at all that Babylon came in, destroyed Jerusalem, and conquered Judah. In fact, they took advantage of it. They began plundering and raiding other cities that were left vulnerable and no longer had a nation, right? Jerusalem was the city. It was the capital. It was fortified. So once it was gone, all military power of Judah was gone with it. And so these nations were left, or these other cities in the nations were left unprotected. And the Edomites took advantage, and they would plunder and raid. And we see that in those scriptures because they went in to those other cities. It talks about going in and plundering Jacob because of the violence against your brother Jacob. And that's what's happening here. They were also unkind and inhospitable to Israelite refugees. When the Jewish refugees were running away to try and find a new place instead of being conquered or to get away from the violence, again, the Edomites took advantage of that and oppressed them and did not help them. So verses 1 to 14 are accusations against Edom for their pride and self-exaltation. So those were the two instances. But it goes back to this other bigger conflict going on. Simply put, they thought they were better than Israel, and they participated in their destruction, even though they were kind of cousins, people group cousins. And so this passage here, Obadiah is saying, you should have been looking out for them. You should have been ready to come to their aid when they were in need. And instead, you took advantage of the situation. Look at verses 3 and 4 again. It says, the pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the cleft of the rocks and make your home in the heights, you who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So the Edomites actually did live up in the mountains. That was their home. But that also served as a metaphor for their pride. You who live up in the mountains and look down on everyone else. You who are prideful and look down on everyone else. And so God says to them, you do have it good now, but it's not going to last. You're pointing the finger at Israel because they did get what was coming to them. Remember, this was prophesied. Israel and Judah over and over forsook God, and their destruction came because of it. But something is coming for you too, Edomites, is what Obadiah says. Obadiah predicts their destruction because of their pride and their arrogance, of thinking they are better than Israel and not being there to help them when they needed it. Verses 10 and 11 point this out. They stood by and enjoyed Israel's downfall. When Babylon came to destroy Jerusalem, Obadiah says, you decided to join Babylon rather than resist or offer any assistance. On that day, this is what verse 11 says, on that day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth, Jacob's wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. You might as well have been on the side of the Babylonians here. And so verse 14 says, you waited at the crossroads, but didn't welcome the fugitives that were fleeing. You cut them down, abused them. They could have welcomed those fugitives with open arms. Oh, we know this is a terrible time for your people. But instead, they took advantage of the situation. And so Obadiah says, so as you have done to Israel, well, that is going to be what happens to you. And so after those first 14 verses, you might get the impression that now we're going to get some details into how this will happen. The accusations are laid out against Edom very clearly of what they have done. But then in verse 15, it says this, the day of the Lord is near for all nations, right? First 14 verses, very specific accusations and charges levied against Edom. But verse 15 says, but the day of the Lord is near for all nations. Verse 15 kind of acts as a hinge for the entire book, connecting those first 14 verses with the last 7. So let's read on and see what the second half of the book says. Starting in 15. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. Jacob will be a fire, and Joseph a flame. Esau will be stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. There will be no survivors from Esau, the Lord has spoken. People from Negev will occupy the mountains of Esau, and people from the foothills will possess the land of the Philistines. They will occupy the fields of Ephraim and Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. This company of Israelite exiles who are in Canaan will possess the land as far as Zarephath. The exiles from Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the towns of the Negev. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. All right, so what is going on here? Well, we're getting a clue as to why Obadiah was so interested in this small nation right next to Judah and Israel that we really don't know much about or hear much about in the Bible otherwise. And of course, Obadiah had a vision from the Lord. I mean, that was why he was interested as well. But we also get the larger point that he is trying to make here. Edom's pride is an example of what happens to any and all nations that become prideful and go their own way. The day of the Lord is near. That phrase, the day of the Lord, golly, I could preach an entire sermon on it. Oh, wait, I did. Just in July. That was a really fun study for me. I got to study this whole concept of the day of the Lord, which really runs throughout the Old Testament and also makes some appearances, as I talked about in my sermon. You don't have to go check it out. This is not a plug or anything. makes a few appearances in the New Testament as well. So real quick recap on this idea of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is any time when God confronts human evil and brings about God's purposes in the world. And so here the day of the Lord, Obadiah says, is coming when God will judge any and all nations that are like Edom, full of pride, of arrogance, of self-exaltation. C.S. Lewis told us that pride is the complete anti-God state of mind. It is the vice under which all other vices work. Pride says, I don't need God, and it starts there. And then from once you've said, I don't need God, every other vice is possible. And so Obadiah sees pride not just as an Edom issue, but as a human issue. And this is pretty cool. I learned this studying this. The Hebrew spellings for Edom and Adam are the exact same. Hebrew is an interesting language. You don't really put every single letter. Both of those are three-letter words, Edom and Adam, and so they are spelled the exact same in the Hebrew language. And so Adam is the word for man, right? He was just given the word Adam. In Hebrew, man, humanity, right? Edom and humanity share the exact same issues. Obadiah sees the issue that Edom struggles with as human issues, an issue that all people everywhere deal with. And in that way, God can act against any and all pride and violence and injustice and sin at any time. But thankfully, with Obadiah, as with all the other prophets, God's judgment is not the final answer here. God's judgment is real, make no mistake about it. The nation of Edom is actually completely destroyed within about 100 years of this writing. And so yes, it is coming, destruction is coming for Edom and all who oppose God, but there is still hope. Out of the rubble, God does what God does best. God rebuilds. And all who call on the name of the Lord will participate in God's new Jerusalem coming about. From Obadiah's perspective, days of anguish are opportunities for new births. And the trials and tribulations of today might just become the joys of tomorrow. That might be a word that all of us need to hear right now. I've joked about this a couple times, but back in the spring, I remember when all the lockdowns, everything got started, it was like, it'll be over by summer. And summer is almost over and it ain't gone, right? It feels long, it feels difficult, but maybe these hard times are something that God's going to use to get our attention and out of this build something beautiful in his kingdom. So how about us? Are we ever like the Edomites? And is that to say, are we ever like all other people in humanity? Are we prideful? If pride is the complete anti-God state of mind, then we need to figure out how to not be that way. The problem is you can't just try to be not prideful. C.S. Lewis also talked about humility, which is the opposite of pride. Humility recognizes the need for something else, but of course, there's this paradox in humility. You don't just strive to be humble. You don't just, I'm gonna try my best to have a lot of humility today. I've heard it said, once you think you've got it, you've lost it. There is only seeing God for who God is, and therefore seeing ourselves in our rightful place in relation to God and in relation to God's world. Lewis says that humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's not a poor me, I'm the worst ever, something like that. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. To be humble is to focus on others. Jesus told us that the greatest commandments are 1, to love God, and 2, to love people. And humility is wrapped up in both those two. We cannot possibly love God and love others if we only love ourselves. We must see that our lives were given to us to be given away, to share God's love with others so that all might know of his love and his power and grace. The Edomites had that opportunity. When they saw what was happening to their neighbors, they could have done some very specific things in order to help them, in order to love God by loving others. And yet they chose to go the other way. So I'd encourage you this week to be on the lookout for ways that God might be wanting you to act in his name, to act and to look out for someone else, to show his love to others. Think about that. Ask God to help you see those ways, to see the world with his eyes, to listen for his voice. Thanks again for joining us today. Let's pray together. God, so often we think we know best. We think we know everything that we ought to do. Even if we wouldn't verbalize it, sometimes we think that down in our hearts. And so we ask today that we would lead lives of humility, that we would follow after you, that we would not go our own way, but that we would seek to listen to your voice, and that we would look for opportunities to be your children, to be your ambassadors out in the world, to share your love with a hurting world who needs it. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.